students opened a music and they were just dancing. I mean, it was really lovely.
The countdown is on for Capella Music Festival on Saturday, March 29th at the Festival Green, Camana Bay. An unforgettable experience and non-stop entertainment presented by Cayman Airways and Camana Bay, featuring international stars Ashanti, Clean Bandit, Gramps Morgan, Kamani Marley, and Elaine, Nyla Blackman, and DJ Puffy, alongside local artists and DJs across 3 stages. Purchase at Tier 1 pricing while supplies last at CapellaMusicFestival.com or in-store at Blackbeard's, AA Rubus, FIS MoneyGram, Winter Circle, Tortuga, and Sing's Roadie Shop. Capella Music Festival, Saturday, March 29th. A true festival experience. Brought to you by the Cayman Islands Department of Tourism, the Ministry of Health and Wellness, Hopscotch Productions, Bacardi, Massive Equipment, Barreau Development, and Stingray Media. The countdown is on for Capella Music Festival on Saturday, March 29th at the Festival Green, Camana Bay. An unforgettable experience and non-stop entertainment presented by Cayman Airways and Camana Bay, featuring international stars Ashanti, Clean Bandit, Gramps Morgan, Kamani Marley, and Elaine, Nyla Blackman, and DJ Puffy, alongside local artists and DJs across 3 stages. Purchase at Tier 1 pricing while supplies last at CapellaMusicFestival.com or in store at Blackbeard's, AA Rubus, FIS MoneyGram, Winter Circle, Tortuga, and Sing's Roadie Shop. Capella Music Festival, Saturday, March 29th. A true festival experience. Brought to you by the Cayman Islands Department of Tourism, the Ministry of Health and Wellness, Hopscotch Productions, Bacardi, Massive Equipment, Barreau Development, and Stingray Media. The countdown is on for Capella Music Festival on Saturday, March 29th at the Festival Green, Camana Bay. An unforgettable experience and non-stop entertainment presented by Cayman Airways and Camana Bay, featuring international stars Ashanti, Clean Bandit, Gramps Morgan, Kamani Marley, and Elaine, Nyla Blackman, and DJ Puffy, alongside local artists and DJs across 3 stages. Purchase at Tier 1 pricing while supplies last at CapellaMusicFestival.com or in store at Blackbeard's, AA Rubus, FIS MoneyGram, Winter Circle, Tortuga, and Sing's Roadie Shop. Capella Music Festival, Saturday, March 29th. A true festival experience. Brought to you by the Cayman Islands Department of Tourism, the Ministry of Health and Wellness, Hopscotch Productions, Bacardi, Massive Equipment, Barreau Development, and Stingray Media. The countdown is on for Capella Music Festival on Saturday, March 29th at the Festival Green, Camana Bay. An unforgettable experience and non-stop entertainment presented by Cayman Airways and Camana Bay, featuring international stars Ashanti, Clean Bandit, Gramps Morgan, Kamani Marley, and Elaine, Nyla Blackman, and DJ Puffy, alongside local artists and DJs across 3 stages. Purchase at Tier 1 pricing while supplies last at CapellaMusicFestival.com or in store at Blackbeard's, AA Rubus, FIS MoneyGram, Winter Circle, Tortuga, and Sing's Roadie Shop. Capella Music Festival, Saturday, March 29th. A true festival experience. Brought to you by the Cayman Islands Department of Tourism, the Ministry of Health and Wellness, Hopscotch Productions, Bacardi, Massive Equipment, Barreau Development, and Stingray Media.
Use of Stingray Media, its staff, or contributors. Callers to the program accept full responsibility for the views expressed. The show host and affiliates are not liable for any statements made or any harm claimed. All callers to the program indemnify Straight Talk from all claims. Offensive, defamatory, or unlawful content will not be tolerated. Be a part of the conversation by calling 745-2626. Now, here's Straight Talk with Austin and Ellio on Bobo 103.1.
Okay, man, and happy Monday. I'm your host, Austin Harris.
And I'm Ellio Solomon, and welcome here to Straight Talk. Number to call here up in the studio, 745-2626. And, of course, my colleague will happily hand you over all the WhatsApp information. But, of course, we have a guest today, Mr. Harris.
We certainly do, and I'm anxious to introduce him to the wider audience. But certainly if you're joining us via our live simulcast on either YouTube or Instagram, you already know that we have a guest in studios. In just a few minutes, we will certainly seek to introduce him. But also, if you want to reach out to us, but you don't want to spend those valuable credits, you can, in fact, use our WhatsApp number, 928-2562. From there, you can either send us a WhatsApp audio note or a traditional WhatsApp text message, and we will read or obviously listen to either live whilst we are on the air. But as my colleague pointed out, the good news for the day, I think, is the fact that we have a guest, and not just any guest as well. It is our pleasure, as advertised. We have with us a top lawyer in this jurisdiction, and perhaps even without. He is certainly a Caymanian to the core, having been here for the majority of his life. He has been the chairman of the Board of Cayman Finance from 2009 to 2011. He was also the chairman of the Cayman Islands Stock Exchange and the former senior partner and managing director of international law firm Maples & Calder, and is currently the senior partner at Travers Thorpe Alberga. It is our pleasure to welcome as our guest today as we engage on the subject of beneficial ownership and the wider financial services. Please welcome our guest, Tony Travers.
Good afternoon.
Awesome. Well, I just want, you want me to go start it off? So let me just say, first of all, to the listening public, we chatted a couple of weeks ago. There was an article that appeared in the Compass talking about beneficial ownership. And again, this legislation would be coming into effect, I think, around the end of February. And so we've asked Mr. Anthony Travers, Mr. Tony Travers, we're friends, we can call him that, and we want to get a little bit of understanding about that. But before we do that, let's just discuss the financial services industry and bring everybody up to speed. So, Tony, let me start by saying or asking, tell us a little bit about the Cayman. I mean, you've been here. You told me you were here since the 70s, came here as a younger man. But tell us a little bit about...
Significantly.
Yeah. Oh, we won't get onto the dating site, but anyway.
It's a good one.
It's a good one. Austin and I will share it out with you later on.
Tune into our online portion. We'll give you that detail.
There you go. But share with us a little bit of background in terms of the Cayman Islands of financial services. Why was, if not if, still, the secrecy was so important in the Cayman Islands to get that industry going?
Well, that's a good question, Ellio. I think if you're looking at the issue of confidentiality in the Cayman Islands, you really have to look at the context, the time and the circumstance, because it's changed dramatically over the decades. Now, you mentioned the 1970s. Back then, bear in mind, Cayman had no funds industry. It had no private equity industry. It had no fund finance industry. And it really didn't have a debt issuing industry. I think I did the first debt issue in 1977, the first bond issue. But what it had was a banking industry. In fact, we had about 442 banks, mainly Class B banks, regulated back then. And so the whole story was about banking. And that being the case, I recall it was Mr. Bill Walker and the then Financial Secretary, Mr. Basil Johnson, a very excellent financial secretary, who thought to reinforce banking confidentiality with the introduction then in 1976 of the Confidential Relationships Preservation Law. Now, that law was much misunderstood. it didn't actually initially do much more than consolidate in statutory form the common law right to privacy, which was established in a case called National Provincial Bank and Tourniers, an Old English case of persuasive authority here. It also introduced one additional highly controversial element, and that was to render criminal any unauthorized disclosure of confidential information.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that legislation was highly controversial and led to, as matters developed over the next few decades, the argument that there was tax evasion, tax avoidance happening in the Cayman Islands, and it was all being sheltered. My own view is that wasn't the case.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, very early on in the mid-1980s, the major law firms, certainly mine at the time, Maples, made the move towards institutional business. And that was developed by means of the mutual funds law and the exempted limited partnership law, both of which I drafted for the government. And the shift away from private client happened voluntarily. Nevertheless, the confidential relationships law remained in place, regarded as controversial, seized on by the high-tax NGOs, the high-tax campaigners, Oxfam, Christian Aid, and particularly by the OECD, the French organization that came to the fore in the mid-90s.
Mm-hmm.
And the OECD in 1998, because they're Eurocentric, based in Paris, as I say, decided that tax havens, the expression they developed to describe the Cayman Islands and any jurisdiction which had low or preferential tax rates, were necessarily harmful.
Mm-hmm.
And this report was called the Harmful Tax Competition Report in 1998. 1998 is an interesting year. I'm going to come back to it for another reason. 90% of what the OECD wrote in that report about tax competition being harmful was complete nonsense.
Mm.
They didn't understand how the Cayman Islands worked. They didn't understand the concept of tax neutrality, which maybe we'll come back to talk about a little bit later. And it used the expression tax haven in a highly perjurative, defamatory manner.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I wasn't actually the only person that thought that. Fortunately, at the time, Treasury Secretary O'Neill, in around about 1999, 2000, he was the Treasury Secretary under, I think it was Bush 1, said to the Europeans, no, we don't think tax competition is harmful.
Mm-hmm.
So the only thing that then came out of that report was the whole issue of confidentiality being harmful. And O'Neill, Treasury Secretary, agreed with that. And so in around 2000, the Cayman Islands signed up to the OECD initiative to say that we would have transparency.
Mm-hmm.
And the transparency came about in a number of different ways. Firstly, it came about by way of the reactive double tax, the tax information exchange agreements.
Right.
Remember, the UK was called a double tax treaty, but for no good reason. And we have about 36 of those. And they were reactive in that it allowed tax authorities, in the event of tax evasion or tax avoidance, to make inquiry. And there were procedures and safeguards under that legislation. That didn't answer the criticisms of the high tax campaigners.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't answer the criticisms of certain U.S. senators, particularly Senator Levin, who still thought there was a great deal of tax avoidance or tax evasion going on.
Mm-hmm.
Senator Levin then introduced a proactive tax reporting treaty called FATCA, Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, for U.S. citizens abroad. Interestingly enough, the United States refused to enter into reciprocity with it, which irritated the Europeans again. We start to see this divide between U.S. and European thinking happening now. And so the European Union introduced their own FATCA-like automatic reporting requirement, which is called the Common Reporting Standard, and that came in around 2014. So now we have reactive reporting, we have automatic reporting. And the interesting thing that comes out of all of this is that it establishes, I think beyond a doubt, that what I said earlier was correct. The Cayman Islands had moved in the early 1980s towards institutional tax-neutral structuring, which didn't involve tax evasion or tax avoidance at all. And the astonishing thing is that you find, with all this transparency, you have no prosecutions for tax evasion or tax avoidance of any statistically relevant significance.
Right.
At the same time this was happening, the proceeds of criminal conduct law was developing pretty much in lockstep with the Financial Action Task Force initiatives on anti-money laundering. Now, the Financial Action Task Force is a subsidiary of the OECD, also based in Paris, France. They work pretty much in conjunction, and the agenda was to make life as difficult as possible for offshore financial centers, which they saw to be in competition for capital flows. Why are capital flows so important in Europe? Well, Europe has about 7% of the world's population, but it has 55% of the world's welfare spending. And there isn't any way they can meet the obligations for welfare spending under their social security or welfare benefits programs. Those programs only work if they look like a pyramid when you look at them. That is to say, there are more people at the bottom putting money in than there are at the top taking out.
Right.
Unfortunately, what's happened in Europe is the pyramid now looks more like a cylinder. And that's because there's longevity, because health programs have improved, and because the birth rates in Europe have gone down dramatically, which I think is odd, because after all, that's the one thing the French are supposed to be good at. But apparently not so. They're down they're apparently down to 1.7 per family, when they need to be above 2. They're not. So the belief in Europe, and we've seen this from the European Commission and the FATF and the OECD, is that somehow capital flows moving through the Cayman Islands are eroding, or as the OECD used the word, poaching the tax base in Europe.
Right.
That's complete nonsense, because Cayman Islands has never been approved with a passport under the AIFMD for cross-border marketing in Europe. We don't really market in Europe. There are some Cayman Island funds that are marketed in Europe, but they're marketed under old private placement regimes. It's not that easy to do. And I think when I last looked, less than 6% of the total value passing in through Cayman open-ended and closed-ended funds actually is attributable to EU investment. So the EU position in terms of economics is based on a fallacy. Even if the Cayman Islands weren't here, there wouldn't be additional capital flows to tax in Europe, which leaves one with the conclusion that it's probably just straight embarrassment. None of these European Union countries can balance their books at the moment. They're all grotesquely out of whack with the European Union ratios on debt to GDP. And so I think to them, having a jurisdiction like the Cayman Islands, which functions extremely comfortably and generates $1 billion a year in revenue for, let's face it, 35, you tell me, 40,000 Caymanians?
Yeah,
something like that, yeah. I think that is a huge embarrassment in the European Union, and explains the constant wave of regulation, and I would say unnecessary regulation, that has been forced upon us through the mechanism of and I say unjustifiably through the mechanism of blacklist. And we've had a number of, we've had economic substance, we've had local audit sign-off under the Private Funds Law. The Private Funds Act didn't require to be enacted at all. It's unnecessary. We've had a number of legislative enactments thrust upon us, all of which have substantially increased costs of operation here.
Yeah.
And we get to the point where the question is, are we still competitive? Now, that, I'm afraid, in a rather long-winded way, brings us to the whole question of public access to beneficial ownership.
Right.
There are a couple, 3 points I'd like to make here, unless you have any questions.
No, just there.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it might be common sense to a lot of person, but just for utmost clarity, when we talk about confidentiality, can you tell us what were some of those things that are considered to be confidential information?
Well, under the 1976 statute, any information imparted in a professional capacity was deemed confidential. That wasn't actually a million miles away, as I said, from the old English common law position. It's just it didn't, under English common law, have a criminal sanction for unauthorized disclosure. Now, that basic principle hasn't changed a great deal. But what has changed is the legislation on a right to privacy, a legitimate right to privacy, has changed dramatically. Now, interestingly, I mentioned in 1998 the OECD were pressing to slice open Cayman Island confidentiality, and indeed succeeded through the mechanisms of the tax information exchange agreements. And then we had FATCA and the Common Reporting Standard. And we actually said, so what? We actually don't have anything here to hide anyway. I always thought we'd get more points for having clearly established that, but we never did. It's like, null point in the Eurovision Song Contest. Anyway, the 1998 was interesting because at the very point where the OECD were endeavoring to open up Cayman Island confidentiality, let's even say legitimately, the English government were passing the Human Rights Act,
Right.
which established a right to privacy.
Right.
Fundamental right.
Fundamental right to well, it's less fundamental than it is in the Cayman Islands, Austin, for the reason I'm going to come on to.
Yeah.
Because in England, it's simply a statute.
Okay.
Here,
It's in the
you're dead
Constitution.
right. It's part of our Constitution. Very, very big point. Very big point. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that historical coincidence apart, in 2009, the Cayman Islands Constitution comes into force after, let's not forget, lengthy negotiation between the Cayman Island government and the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, FCDO, and whoever else. I wasn't in the room. I wasn't in that room at the time.
I was in one of those, but yeah.
You may well have been in one. And you could tell me what happened in it.
I will, yeah.
Because I'm a little confused.
That would be
Yeah.
There we have in Cayman a fundamental, as Austin rightly says, right to privacy, personal affairs, in almost identical words to the English legislative position under the Human Rights Act, which, we can go on, not incidentally, mirrors exactly the provisions of the European Convention on Human Rights, which applies to the remaining 27 European Union countries. They have a fundamental right to privacy for legitimate affairs.
Yeah.
Your personal affairs, your bank account,
Yeah.
your private correspondence. In America, we have the Fourth Amendment. Now, admittedly, the Fourth Amendment deals with more with the right to seizure pursuant to warrant, and what may be seized and what may not be seized. But if you look at the case law surrounding the Fourth Amendment, they call it the penumbra surrounding the Fourth Amendment, you see very clearly it establishes what is private and what isn't, and where authorities can go with a search warrant, which has to be duly applied for and obtained. So we have in America something very, very similar, and in America the Right to Privacy Act, which deals with governmental, the way governments deal with private
individuals.
Obtain it,
Yeah.
In addition to all of that, we have in Europe the data protection legislation.
Okay.
Now, the European Commission, which is actually unto itself, it's a non-accountable body. Very few people actually realize the European Commission appoints the European Commission.
That's
And
helpful.
there's no democratic process.
Right.
And that's because the chap who drafted the European Union documents, a chap called Delors, who was a closet Marxist, because what he did was photostat the statutory documentation that constituted the Russian Politburo. So it has a very, very similar framework. So yes, people say you have a European Union Parliament, but they have no authority. So the European Commission decide amongst themselves that there should be public access in Europe to all private information in contravention of the European Convention on Human Rights and in contravention of the data protection policy. And that goes to court in Europe. 2 years ago, there's a case called Sovim, Luxembourg court, I think. Mishcon de Rea with the English law firm involved in fighting it very successfully. And the European Court of Justice strikes down the European Commission directive and says no.
Unconstitutional?
It's unconstitutional. And there is a right to privacy under the European Convention on Human Rights and data protection, which cannot be overridden. That dispute remains in Europe to this day.
Really?
To this day. It hasn't been resolved because the European Commission have no statutory authority under the European Union constitutional documentation to legislate for an individual country. They can make recommendations through directives, which are supposed to be imposed into law, but in actual fact, you find across Europe a complete discrepancy. For example, Italy, Latvia, and Hungary have no beneficial ownership registers. Germany has one, apparently open to the public.
Right.
So complete confusion in Europe.
But it's certainly not a global standard as one would otherwise have you believe.
We are absolutely getting to the point, Austin, that you've just made, that it is not a global standard. Quite correct. In America, where there is no beneficial ownership registry whatsoever, they introduced a year or so ago, 23 I think, the Corporate Transparency Act, which come the Trump administration has just been suspended by Scott Bessent, the new Treasury Secretary, and will not go into effect for U.S. domestic corporations. Arguably, they're going to produce some regulations that foreign companies owning U.S. real estate may well.
And just as a
may
point
well
of
have
clarification for the listening audience, the Corporate Transparency Act is the UK's version of the beneficial
U.S. version.
U.S. version of the beneficial ownership.
With one distinction, Austin, it was never going to be public.
Never going to be public.
Never going to be public.
I see.
I'll just finish off quickly here because I know you're going to take a break.
Yep. Thank you.
We had a very, very satisfactory beneficial ownership registry with documented and verified information. And it was available to law enforcement and to tax authorities. And we have yet to hear why that needs to be made available to the public.
Indeed. Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, we do have to, and I thank you very much for acknowledging that, Tony. We do have to pause and take a short commercial break. But certainly I think that's a useful point to pick up when we come back. Because to your point, we have been battling this whole public registry of beneficial ownership for some time in the Cayman Islands. We proposed an alternative solution, which up until recently was deemed satisfactory to the international bodies, but in particular the UK. But as we are just discovering, I'm just discovering, certainly, there could very well be changes on the next horizon as it relates to this subject. So the battle continues to rage in terms of public beneficial ownership here in the Cayman Islands. To help us better understand this conversation, its impact on the Cayman Islands, and perhaps arguably more important, what do we do to avoid what could very well be described as calamitous circumstances? Well, you're going to have to continue to listen. The phone lines are open, 745-2626, but I encourage our listeners to keep listening because we have a wealth of information that we want to cover and very little time in which to do so. But we're going to pause, take a short commercial break, check in with the BBC News, but keep it locked. There will be more Straight Talk still to come right here on Bobo 103.1 FM.
Bobo FM. We're making Bobo FM bigger and better. We've got a brand new frequency with even more power. Retune your FM radio to 103.1 now. This is Bobo FM, the home of the BBC World Service, the most trusted news source in the world.
The countdown is on for Capella Music Festival on Saturday, March 29th at the Festival Green, Camana Bay. An unforgettable experience and non-stop entertainment presented by Cayman Airways and Camana Bay, featuring international stars Ashanti, Clean Bandit, Gramps Morgan, Kamani Marley, and Elaine, Nyla Blackman, and DJ Puffy, alongside local artists and DJs across 3 stages. Purchase at Tier 1 pricing while supplies last at CapellaMusicFestival.com or in store at Blackbeard's, AA Rubis, FIS MoneyGram, Winter Circle, Tortuga, and Sing's Roadie Shop. Capella Music Music Festival, Saturday, March 29th. A true festival experience. Brought to you by the Cayman Islands Department of Tourism, the Ministry of Health and Wellness, Hopscotch Productions, Bacardi, Massive Equipment, Barreau Development, and Stingray Media.
Callers to the program accept full responsibility for the views expressed. The show host and affiliates are not liable for any statements made or any harm claimed. All callers to the program indemnify Straight Talk from all claims. Offensive, defamatory, or unlawful content will not be tolerated. Be a part of the conversation by calling 745-2626. Now, here's Straight Talk with Austin and Ellio on Bobo 103.1.
And welcome back, K-Man, to more Straight Talk here on Bobo 103.1 FM with your host, Ellio Solomon, and myself, Austin Harris. The phone lines, well, they're not quite yet open. Neither are the WhatsApp lines. But our conversation with our guest, Anthony Travers, is as vibrant as it can get, and it's going to get better. We have with us in studios again Mr. Anthony Travers, helping us to understand a bit better the circumstances behind beneficial ownership, and in particular the desire by certain groups to make those public those registries public. Again, we're going to continue in that vein. But again, reminding the listening audience that we are broadcasting live on your radio dial at 103.1 FM and simulcasting live on YouTube and Instagram.
So continuing on, Mr. Travers, the situation is that, I mean, I heard the analogy given that the privacy is a bit like the homeowner with the curtain pulled across. Doesn't mean he's doing something wrong. He just wants a certain level of privacy. Right. So you talked earlier on about the European Commission, and again, they're trying to break this veil of privacy. And you also mentioned, I heard you say something to the effect that the individual was a bit of a Marxist. Marxist. So tell us, why do you think exactly the European Commission is and was trying to do that?
Well, I think they have their own narrative. Moscovici, who I think was the most troubling European Union tax commissioner, wasn't actually just a Marxist. He was actually once head of the French Trotskyite party. So he was probably one of the most extreme Marxists you could come across. These people seem to rise to the top of the European Union framework, possibly because they're familiar with it from their history in Russia. As I said, a very, very similar framework. And the European Union seems to promote people of this sort, and they are fiercely anti-capitalist. As you can see now with subsequent policy, they've made a complete mess of the industry and economies of most of these European Union countries, which are in deficit now.
Yeah.
And so you have to ask the question. I don't know exactly what goes on inside these people's minds, but they are very, very envious of a successful capitalist structure.
Yeah.
And I think it's an embarrassment to them. There is another part of the narrative here which you've really led me to, quite helpfully, and that is that the most recent part of the initiative, which was to open our beneficial ownership registry to public scrutiny, admittedly through the means of something called an interested person, which includes a journalist, none of which is defined. But if it's a journalist, you can conclude that that means effectively the public at large.
Yeah. And see, I want to pause you right there because just to make sure that no one in the public loses this. You talked earlier on about FATCA. You talked about the CRS system. Right. And it's important to everyone listening to understand that you're saying that these and our MLAT treaties that we had, so there was already ways for legitimate authorities to be able to get a lot of information in terms of what's happening in the Cayman Islands.
Well, that's absolutely correct, except I changed your phrase there to say all the information.
Okay, all the information.
All the information they needed. And in the light of that structure, what I said earlier to Austin remains the case. There appears to have been no statistically relevant information obtained that has led to any significant prosecutions for money laundering, criminal activity, tax evasion, or tax avoidance.
Good. And so
So the question, sorry, I'll finish, then you go right ahead. The question is, what problem are we solving for?
Yes.
Yeah, precisely what I was going to say is, so if we understand that we've got the MLAT treaty, we've got the FATCA, we've got the CRS, they can get all the information, the right authorities can get the information that they want, or all the information, as you've said. The question is now, in the room, the $1 million question, or the $64,000 one, whatever it is why are you now making it that it's average, anyone pretty much in the media can just come along and say, hey, I have access to the information?
Well, the answer to that question, of course, is I wasn't in the room when the Cayman Island government were negotiating with the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office or the Treasury or whomsoever it may have been.
By the way, I wasn't in the room on that one either.
No.
Okay.
Well, it was quite recent. Quite recent. Last year, in fact.
Really?
Yes. Well, last year. Well, they came back, and the communique that I no doubt was drafted by the British government office, which the Cayman government were no doubt requested to sign off on and did, talks in terms, the rationale, to answer the question, talks in terms of public access being a global standard. But it clearly isn't.
So
it clearly isn't. It isn't, we now know, in America.
Right.
It's just been effectively rescinded. The Corporate Transparency Act's effect has been rescinded for domestic corporations. It isn't even in Europe, where we have jurisdictions which don't even have a public, don't even have a beneficial ownership registry, let alone a public one. And, you know, clearly there is no public access in Singapore. There is no public access in Hong Kong. There's no public access in the UAE. So, you know, I would be delighted if somebody could explain to me how
Redefine
this
global.
described as a global standard.
Yeah.
It is a standard. Well, there may be one reason why it's called a global standard. It may be there are within the Foreign and Commonwealth Office still individuals who think the world revolves around London. And since the United Kingdom has introduced public access, that is therefore the global standard. I mean, that may be the delusion. I don't know. As I say, I wasn't in the room and not able to disabuse them.
It's a bit like the Americans when they say with the sports, the World Series.
The world champions. World champions, Super Bowl.
So,
Yeah.
So why do you think? So you think then basically our politicians may have been locked in a room and being told or handed over with a little small stick or something by the UK saying that this is a global standard, you have to put this in place?
I wouldn't deign to speculate.
Okay.
I wouldn't deign to speculate on what was said in that room. But I do know that the communique that was issued after those meetings cannot possibly be right. It is not a global standard and won't be a global standard now, not in the foreseeable future. I do know that there are two English politicians who have been trying very, very hard to get public access. And I think the reason for this is because you have to actually ask the question, the real question about money laundering. Now, I was in the room in the mid-1990s when the Foreign and Commonwealth Office came to the Cayman Islands and said there's something called the FATF, Financial Action Task Force. There is $2 trillion of black money laundered globally. We said, well, we don't see it laundered here, sir. And they said, well, we don't care what you think. You're going to have to introduce these amendments to your Process Criminal Conduct Law, suspicious activity reporting, to deal with this money laundering problem. Now, 20, 30 years later, we understand that the global money laundering problem is not $2 trillion, but it's between $3 and $4 trillion. And what we know is that whatever legislation has been introduced by the FATF to combat the problem has been an epic failure. Less than 1% of suspicious activity or suspicious transaction reports, they're now called, STRs, result in an interdiction of funds. Less than 1% globally. So, and we know that drug usage in the U.S. is at least twice what it was 30 years ago.
Right.
They increased fentanyl, so the money is going to be twice what it was. So the estimates made, they're apocryphal, but the estimates made of $3 to $4 trillion now circulating, I would guess are probably reasonably accurate. I have no first-hand knowledge, obviously. Well,
So
there needs to be. Sorry.
Yeah, so no, I wanted to jump in to say again, back on the point of if we have all of the various agencies through tax exchange agreements, through CRS, et cetera, they can get all of this information, what's the purpose in allowing it that the media can come and get it? Now, I remember several years ago when Austin and I were on the show initially, and I looked at some of the information out there. I know, for example, the UK, BBC is highly funded, for example, by the UK. Is it a case that somebody's seeing this as a potential backdoor? It's a lot easier to give them, because if they go through the proper way, in some instances they say, oh, well, that's phishing, right?
No, I think.
What do you think's happening?
No, I think the phishing argument's long gone.
Okay.
The authorities can get access to the information here now without any judicial review within 24 hours. They inquire very, very infrequently.
Right.
Very, very infrequently. But the point I was going to make,
Okay.
if the numbers now call it $3 trillion, where is it? And I'll tell you where it is.
Tell.
It's in London,
Yes.
New York, Chicago.
Onshore.
It absolutely isn't here because we know who owns everything here.
Quite right.
We have documented beneficial ownership information. We know who owns things here.
Right.
They don't know in England, and I'll tell you why they don't know in England. Because in Companies House, they have 4 million companies, they have 25 employees, and they have no requirements like we have in the Cayman Islands for verified, documented, and certified information. So, in England, they have a Wild West show. They don't know what's going on. They don't know who owns what. They've suddenly passed some legislation saying foreign ownership of property in the UK has to be disclosed. So they're starting to work on the problem. But in the meantime, I think they are seriously embarrassed. And this demand for public access to beneficial ownership information in the Cayman Islands is a huge exercise in blame deflection.
Just point a finger.
And that is where I want to take us. I mean, I'll call it how I see it. It seems to me very obvious that this whole issue is about, competition. We're in competition with the City of London, who have established their own financial services center, and they quite frankly want, a bit of that success, if you will, that has, the Cayman Islands has enjoyed. But my question is more specifically, on this issue of global standard, which again, I think you've, made the point that it is no global standard. But when we talk about the compliance rules that exist and have existed in the Cayman Islands since Jesus was a boy and since this whole financial services industry has obviously matured, how does that compliance stack up against some of the major centers in, the U.S., Switzerland, Singapore, the UK for that matter?
It's very, very difficult to give a straight answer to that because in some of these jurisdictions you'll find similar looking compliance.
Right.
The whole question is how effectively is it enforced?
Right.
In Cayman, they take a very, very strict approach to enforcement, which means we are burdened with extraordinary costs of compliance. There are significant fines being levied by registrar of companies and the Monetary Authority for non-compliance, regardless of whether there is any underlying money laundering issue. The problem with the compliance industry is it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
Failure to comply, regardless of any underlying issue, is of itself an offense and finable. And we take that very seriously. The result, to go to your point about competition, is we are fast becoming uncompetitive.
Yes.
Right.
Because of the costs of maintaining strict compliance with this legislation, which is now disproportionate to any real risk.
Indeed.
There's no proportionality
Yeah.
between the levels of compliance that we are now faced with and the actual risk of money laundering.
Right.
As I think both of you would probably know, you can't actually deposit $10,000 in a bank here.
Yeah.
So when you look at the money laundering cases recently, you find in every case there's a corrupt bank. We know for a fact you don't have corrupt banks in Cayman. Everybody would know about it within 2 minutes.
Quite right.
But Danske Bank in Estonia, with the help of Deutsche Bank, laundered 200 billion. The National Westminster Bank in Bradford in England was taking a deposit every Friday from a jeweler's of £2 million in cash, which was then being laundered through the Middle East, the UAE. They've been prosecuted and convicted. But these things were happening in a way that would be inconceivable in the Cayman Islands.
Quite right. And to your point, at home and some of the areas you've just identified are the places where we need to be concerned, the global authority, the global standard. These are areas that where these crimes are happening, to your point, every day. This is where the attention should be drawn.
Yes.
But it's not.
It's not. No, for various political reasons. In all of this, you have to realize, we don't have a canal like Panama.
Yeah.
We don't have a vote in the United Nations like the Bahamas.
Yeah.
So we've always been the low-hanging fruit
Yeah.
in terms of dealing with capital players. And we've also been the victims of our own success. If you look at the numbers now, difficult to get all the numbers because less than half of the private equity structures are actually regulated under the Private Funds Act. But even with the 17,000 that are, you're looking at about $8 trillion flowing through the Cayman Islands. Now, that is a staggering amount of money. In terms of the alternative investment industry, it's larger in alternative investments than Luxembourg and Dublin combined.
Yes.
That's why the European Union, whether they're Marxist or not, are very, very aggressive.
Correct.
About Cayman Islands.
But whether you're able to say definitively or not, one has to be able to say that what is transpiring is nevertheless you have the UK, who is in actual competition with its own territory, and the legislation that you're thrusting upon us, intentional or not, is making it that we're totally you're killing their competition.
And for another very important reason, which we need to come on to, the issue of legitimate privacy is critically important to high net worth individuals who are establishing trusts or foundations for the purposes of succession planning and generational wealth transfer. That industry here has been decimated because of the talk of public beneficial ownership, with the result that there are flourishing industries in Wyoming and South Dakota and various U.S. states where there is no transparency whatsoever. And you will not find Central and South Americans who are keen in establishing their trust in a jurisdiction or foundation, in a jurisdiction where there is public beneficial ownership, because they have problems to deal with called kidnapping, extortion, identity theft. There are 2,000 kidnappings a year in Mexico City alone. And so public access to beneficial ownership, for which Ellio pointed out earlier, no justifiable reason was established, is actually highly damaging in that it renders our private client industry less competitive with those of other jurisdictions.
And that is the point I wanted to make. You certainly spoke about capital flow. Capital flow is extremely fluid, and even more so in this technological age where it's a simple click of a button. We had a system that was working. We had a system that was available and transparent, largely unrestricted. But now it's going to be, the doors are going to be knocked wide open. How does that impact the fundamental business of the Cayman Islands financial services sector going forward?
Well, I think it, in the way I just mentioned, certainly in relation to private client. I think it is much less attractive now to a Central South American, even a Chinese. We can ask questions about how they got their money out of China and all the rest of that good stuff, but many do. Many have, industries, businesses overseas that they could usefully have settled on Cayman Island Trust for succession planning purposes. Maybe all that goes away too. There are, of course, other jurisdictions in the world where public access is simply not attractive if you're looking at setting up, a multi-generational structure for the benefit of successive generations. In the funds industry, again, when people talk about financial services, you have to break it down. So, funds industry, now with the new legislation, funds are included. There is an alternative route to compliance, but nevertheless, it's going to require the information to be provided within 24 hours if requested. So there is a compliance cost that wasn't there previously. All in all, if I have a relatively small corporate service provider license and regulated by SEMA, but if you look at the additional personnel that are required just to undertake the uploading process, it's significant cost. And all of that renders us less and less competitive.
Yes, indeed. We do have to pause. It's 27 minutes past the hour of 5 o'clock. And of course, we're continuing our conversation and discussion with Mr. Tony Travers. But on the subject of beneficial ownership, again, just to sort of recap, 2017, we instituted a system called the Platform that served the Cayman Islands relatively well. It facilitated unrestricted mutual exchange on beneficial ownership information between countries and tax and law enforcement authorities. And that worked satisfactorily, and that seemed to, satisfy the powers that be. But just last year, obviously, some changes were made legislatively that will see the introduction of public central registries instituted in the Cayman Islands. Obviously, that is extremely harmful to Cayman's financial services business. But you just talked about high net worth individuals, but you also mentioned mutual funds. It seems that Cayman's financial services industry moving towards corporations and corporate investments, largely in the fund business. Are the two mutually exclusive in terms of the business potentially we may stand to lose or not? And also, Cayman Finance, in your own experience, have been actively involved in the negotiations, assisting presumably previous administrations in these ongoing negotiations. Clearly, well, that's my question. Clearly, they're supposed to represent the financial services industry, so surely they must have strong objections to this demand for public beneficial registries. That is where we go when we come back. The phone lines will be open, 745-2626, and we have at least one question on the WhatsApp. But keep it locked. There'll be more Straight Talk still to come on 103.1 FM.
K-Man, could it be you? Tortuga's 10K giveaway is back, and someone's walking away with $10,000 in cash every time you spend $25 at
indemnify Straight Talk from all claims. Offensive, defamatory, or unlawful content will not be tolerated. Be a part of the conversation by calling 745-2626. Now, here's Straight Talk with Austin and Ellio on Bobo 103.1.
And welcome back, man, to more Straight Talk here on Bobo 103.1 FM with your host, Ellio Solomon, and myself, Austin Harris. And we continue to be joined in studios by our guest, Mr. Tony Travers, taking a quick look at the beneficial ownership regime and, of course, now the demand, surprise, surprise, for the moving of the goalposts yet again towards public beneficial ownerships as the conversation continues. And I know my colleague is anxious to get, back onto the questions, but just prior to the break, there's a saying, I think Ellio oftentimes says it, that politicians don't always have to be experts on everything, but they certainly should be able to access the experts. And when it comes to defending Cayman's financial services sector, the current government, previous administrations have depended heavily on Cayman Finance. You certainly sat at the chair of that organization in the early days. So presumably, they're guiding the government in dealing or negotiating with these obvious challenges such as public beneficial ownership. My question is Cayman Finance still the adequate gatekeeper to protecting Cayman's financial services sector, or has it somehow, over the years, become watered down to more general acceptance of the status quo that comes with, let's just call it what it is, the larger countries of the world that apply pressure, particularly in this context, the United Kingdom?
Well, that's a very good question that I don't think I'm fully competent to answer. I was the original chairman of, as it then was, the Cayman Financial Services Association, became renamed Cayman Finance. I can tell you that when I was chairman, had a very effective public relations campaign through two public relations companies, one a very well politically connected company in Washington, D.C., and one in London. And we were taking a very, what you might call, robust line on all of these issues. I can also tell you that it didn't suit everybody in Cayman Finance.
Right.
You have to understand that there are professions in Cayman. I'm not going to mention any names, but let's just call them the accountants.
Yes, okay, fair enough.
Who actually make great deals of money, great deal of money, out of managing this regulatory overreach.
Yes.
And I'm not sure what Cayman Finance may or may not have said, but I do know that the accountants are very firmly in favor and had the ear of government. And so a great deal of the regulatory overreach that we are subjected to today has come about as a result of that advice.
So you have a group that sort of benefits from it here.
No question.
So I wanted to take two things. One would be just to really laymanize the whole issue of how this potentially making it that just about anyone calling themselves a media house can come in and get information, people getting more access to information publicly. How is that, again, laymanize it in terms of the effects and, help the average guy to understand, here's an individual that's walking around with $100 million, they own a bank account or whatever. How is that legislation affecting him or her potentially?
Well,
you talked about kidnapping, etc.
Well, I'm not sure it necessarily gains you access to bank account information, but you would, by reverse engineering from the other end of the funnel, if you found a house in the United Kingdom, say, in a very expensive part of London, owned by a Cayman or a BVI company, be able to then come to Cayman or the BVI and find out who owns that property. And that of itself could give rise to kidnapping issues, identity theft issues. Now, having mentioned the BVI, but briefly, the last time I looked, Miss Lorna Smith in the BVI was taking a very resistant approach to the issue of public access. I can't say with certainty where that ended up today, whether she prevailed or not. But initially her reaction was that that was just a non-starter. And she came out and said so. But that was over a year ago, so I'm not quite sure.
So three more questions. So you're saying now, and one of the things that you published or was published in the Compass was the U.S. isn't really having this, right? And tell us about what's the U.S. position and how is that beneficial to us?
It's not beneficial to us, it's competitive to us.
Okay.
The U.S. position is now, following Treasury Secretary Besant's suspension of the Corporate Transparency Act a couple of weeks ago, that there is no filing whatsoever for domestic corporations in terms of their beneficial ownership. No filing whatsoever. Only foreign corporations owning property or doing business in the U.S. will have to file. But even so, that is not going to be made public. It's only available to FinCEN, which is their equivalent of law enforcement. FinCEN is a division of the U.S. Treasury.
I see. I had a question for you because I also want to ask the question of, what are some of the things that perhaps Cayman could do? But let me just ask you one other question before that was texted into me. Cayman's constitution obligates all government organs to act proportionately to the legitimate aims pursued.
Yes.
If the Universal Beneficial Ownership Registry access is disproportionate to its legitimate aims pursued, then isn't it unconstitutional under our Constitution?
Well, the answer to that question is yes.
Yeah.
If it is established it is disproportionate, it is clearly unconstitutional. But you don't even really need to get to the issue of proportionality. If you say the right to privacy, itself contained in Section 9 of the Bill of Rights, is a constitutional and fundamental right, and you say and establish before a court that this public access to beneficial ownership contravenes that right, then the public access should be struck down and is unconstitutional.
Your comment about, with all of this is a matter that perhaps the government, we don't know, but perhaps the government was obviously dragged into a room and duped somehow into doing this, believing it was the global standard, but it's not. Is there anything, considering all of that we know now, that is not a global standard, is there anything that the Cayman Islands could be doing in terms of trying to reverse where we put ourselves again?
Well, it's a good question, but you're asking the wrong guy.
Oh, all right. Well,
you simply have to ask those who are in the room what was said to them, what representations were made,
right,
what promises were made, and whether they believe there is any possibility of going back and renegotiating. But bear in mind, this matter was put before the House in November.
Yes.
And I think by a very narrow majority, or maybe it was not a narrow majority.
No.
It was 9-1, I think. I think a lot of people abstained. That was the point. And notwithstanding a very stirring address from the Honourable McKeever Bush about the dangers of this policy.
Yes.
I think I'm right in saying he was the one vote against it.
Yes. No, I think you're absolutely
that
right.
would not surprise us.
But the government, well, it's worth reading his presentation in Hansard because it actually is a remarkably good coverage of these issues. But the government voted for it, and I think I take back what I said earlier. I think it was 9-1 in the end. A lot of abstentions. So you have to ask your question to the government that voted in favour of it.
And to that point, certainly the government that brought this motion, and I think just for the chronological order, to say the least,
for the avoidance of doubt,
you'll remember that a certain group, 4 cabinet ministers and 1 MP, left the government in November of 2024. But certainly there was general agreement from the Parliament that these amendments, financial services amendments, were so gravely important to the people of the Cayman Islands and the financial services sector that it was introduced by the then former Minister of Financial Services at the time it went to Parliament. And to your point, the government in large majority approved it, albeit with a number of abstentions. But to Mr. Travers' point, it is election time, and if you're concerned about the lifeblood and the future success of the Cayman Islands Financial Services Center, but more importantly, you'd like some elucidation as to what happened. Did we have the wool pulled over our eyes, or did they bend our arm in order to get this done? This is the perfect question to ask, the former Minister of Financial Services, Andre Ebanks, who is the tip of the spear at the Caymanian Community Party. These are questions that should be addressed directly to them.
They're supported across the aisle, even though they left, right?
Quite right, and they were assisted by obviously the majority, if not majority, members of the opposition, who obviously said, "Listen, we will work with you as long as you don't bring contentious legislation, or in this case, if it's in the best interest of the Cayman Islands." I guess they too were duped into believing it's in the best interest. We do have one rather, how should we say it? Significant question from the listening audience coming into the program itself.
Okay.
But it begins with, first of all, thanking you, Mr. Travers, for your contributions to the Cayman Islands and its financial sector. You certainly stood at the forefront, if not at the gate, and fought for a business model that has been under global attack for decades. But you certainly have been weary to say the least, and marked, but certainly you were right there on the front lines.
Battle hardened, I think.
Battle hardened, yes, is the word. Yes, I was missing that. Quite right. Thank you very much. He'll be quoting Winston Churchill later on, which, we have no problems with either that.
We're happy for that, yeah.
There might be even a nice limerick in there, too.
Well,
but that's for another day.
How about never, never, never give up?
Yeah. Quite right, indeed. Yes, we shall fight on. Anyway, this question, given the ongoing global initiatives led by organizations such as the OECD, particularly the BEPS, or Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Framework, and the regulatory landscape shaped by instruments like the FATCA, what is your assessment of the likelihood that the United States, under the current or future administrations, might shift its focus towards establishing a structure of tax neutrality within its own territories or jurisdictions under its administration? They go on. Specifically, how plausible is it that a territory such as the U.S. Virgin Islands could be transformed into a tax-neutral jurisdiction similar to other global financial centers? If such a policy direction were pursued, what could be the broader implications or ripple effects on the global stage, particularly in relation to international tax competitiveness, financial transparency obligations, and the global regulatory environment? I can repeat any part of that if you need it again.
It's a very clever question.
Mm-hmm.
Must be a lawyer.
Yes. There are a number of points in that question.
Yes.
The first one isn't actually the main point of the question, but I'll come on to the main point. The first point is that the base erosion profit shifting, or BEPS as you described it in shorthand, initiative is under serious pressure from the Trump administration. The OECD have been trying to introduce something called Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 structuring, which is grotesquely complicated, which is a delight to the accountants, and which is designed to stop U.S. corporations reducing profit on the sale of their product in the point-of-sale jurisdictions in Europe through the mechanism of double tax treaties. President Trump appears to be vehemently opposed to, and the United States, as a result, will probably now not participate in Pillar 2.
Mm-hmm.
And so this whole initiative, I think, is on the point of falling completely flat.
Okay.
I don't actually have a problem with it falling flat, because it's another attempt by the OECD to avoid the truth of the issue. And the truth of the issue does actually implicate us, in a positive way, if the truth is told. The BEPS initiative arises because of the failure of double tax treaty structuring to properly recompense the point of sale jurisdiction. And that is because the double tax treaty mechanisms are hugely abused, mainly by US corporations, because the double tax treaties don't work. But the OECD won't admit the double tax treaties don't work because the double tax treaties are based on the OECD model.
Right.
So what they're endeavoring to do is say we're losing this money through tax avoidance. We want to blame the Cayman Islands in some way, but the Cayman Islands aren't party to double tax treaties. And the truth of it is that the double tax treaty jurisdictions are all in the EU, and they are enabling the reduction of profit in the point of sale jurisdictions by admittedly abusive structuring, which emphasizes deduction for research and development. It emphasizes deductions for interest. It emphasizes all kinds of deductions for royalty payments, all of which reduce the profitability in the point of sale jurisdiction to almost zero, and all of which money is eventually funneled back to the US corporates. Now, I don't see President Trump agreeing with the OECD solution to this. The real answer, the truth of the answer, would be to start to reconsider all of the double tax treaties, which the OECD refused to do. But here's the paradox in the question. If you actually look at what the EU are concerned about and what the OECD are concerned about, it's actually the fact that the US already has tax-free gateways which attract international capital.
Right.
All the Cayman Islands is doing is conduiting international capital flows to take advantage of US tax benefits. For example, the US does not tax interest on US treasuries, bonds or notes. The US does not tax capital gains on securities profits made by non-resident entities, i.e. our mutual funds.
Yes.
So in actual fact, you find that the US is really the root cause of the EU problem. The Cayman Islands is actually almost an unwitting bystander in that we structure the vehicles that enable these capital flows to go in and take advantage of the US tax-free initiatives. But the question insofar as it says, could the US become a sort of tax haven is already partially answered in that it gives those tax-free benefits to foreign investors. Now, the last part of the question, I think, was whether you could take the USVI, US Virgin Islands, and construct a competitive jurisdiction. I'm much more worried about the UAE.
Right.
They're doing the same thing already. Singapore, Hong Kong, other jurisdictions, which are already, by virtue of the increased costs of operation in Cayman, proving to be very competitive. Yes, it could be done. It can't be done overnight. If you take a look at the USVE, it's a bit like Cayman 150 years ago.
Okay. Not to put too fine a point on it.
Well, they got some nice hotels, but not that I was actually here 150 years ago.
Rumor has it.
I just look that way. But
Remarkably well preserved. Remarkably.
But you need infrastructure. You need people. You need buildings. You need expertise. There have been attempts, through Puerto Rico has certain tax benefits. There have been attempts to do these things, but by and large, there is a long runway to getting, from a piece of rock that time forgot,
Right.
to sufficient infrastructure to meet, at least the minimum global international standards that we know exist.
Yeah.
So takes a lot of people, takes a lot of personnel, takes a lot of hard work, and it's taken us 50 years to get where we are now.
Yeah.
So I'm not that worried about the USVI. In terms of anything, there is often a line run by the English fund lawyers who, in their way, are somewhat resentful of the success of the Cayman Islands, even though they use Cayman where they have to. And they say, well, we could create tax-free zones in the UK, and we could do exactly what you're doing. And the truth of it is, yes, they could. But politically, it's a very difficult thing to do. And I think it would be in the US to create a tax-free zone where you have a lot of very wealthy people. It's all Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders would need. They'd be she would be on the warpath. It's a very difficult thing to do, to create a tax-free structure where, this chap's driving in his Mercedes-Benz, having tax-free income over here, and this chap down the street is not. So this thought has been bandied around significantly. I don't see any indication that that's where the Trump administration is going.
Right.
I see them really not supporting these OECD, which is a European organization, as I said, endeavors to, to increase taxes in point-of-sale jurisdictions.
Yes.
I think that's where the internecine warfare is going to come out. And bear in mind now, you also have the so-called Global South encouraging the United Nations, because of the dissatisfaction with the OECD approach, which has been heavily Eurocentric, encouraging the United Nations to come up with its alternative global tax structure. Now, I've heard a huge amount of waffle about what that's supposed to be. I can't, for the life of me, put my finger on what it is they're trying to do.
Right.
And the United Nations, of course, has not distinguished itself in glory recently in the Middle East. So the ability of the United Nations and Gutierrez, their whatever he is, chairman, president, to sit down across a table with President Trump, given his political leanings in the Middle East, I think it's probably remote to none right now. So, I'm sitting back and watching this UN OECD celebrity death match with each. I've got front row tickets. I'm fascinated by how this pans out, but I'm not losing any sleep over it.
Well, in the 3 minutes that we have remaining, I wonder if you can gaze into that crystal ball and all that we've discussed so far. And again, there's a lot of unknowns, including the fact that you weren't in the room during the negotiations. But looking into the challenges that are coming or over the next horizon, should financial services in the Cayman Islands be genuinely worried, or is it, a dip from the $8 trillion that goes through the Cayman Islands down to $7.5?
Well,
not even a blip on the radar.
The banking deposits went from $5 billion to just over $1 billion. We went from 432 banks to just over 100. Can that happen? Yes, it can happen. You have a golden goose. You need to take care of your golden goose. If you look at the numbers on company corporations, hedge funds, and private equity structures, they are flattening somewhat worryingly. It's difficult to get the most up-to-date numbers. They're very slow with publishing them at the moment, but they're clearly flattening. Companies have gone over 20, 30 years from 100,000 to 122,000. It's, about 2% a year increase. That's almost a flat line. The next move, unless you do something positive, is usually down, not up. If you look at the recent statistics on employees in the financial services industry, you find they're flatlined. Expensive to do business here, expensive to live here, and a lot of work is being back officed out of here. So, do empires go on forever? No, they don't. Do I know which way the Cayman Islands is going next? No, I don't. I wouldn't profess to make any assessment, but I know that you need to be very, very careful about listening to anything you hear in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and you need to be very, very careful about the costs of operation of your financial services industry in the Cayman Islands.
Yes, indeed. Well, it is 5:58, and we do need to pause and go off to the BBC News. But when we come back, and noting we do have at least one voice note on the WhatsApp number, obviously with a question therein as well. But when we come back, he just mentioned taking care of the golden goose, obviously referring to financial services. We've heard from Cayman Finance recently saying that financial services, what they really need are work permits, at any limit, so that they can obviously hire the right people to lead the financial services industry from strength to strength. It seems to me, though, from the basis of our conversation today, that we're fluffing the wrong set of feathers. But that conversation shall continue when Straight Talk returns on Bobo 103.1 FM.
Welcome to our newsroom here in central London. We place ourselves here at a little desk right in the thick of things.
OS from the BBC.
We can catch the very latest news from our colleagues, not just in this enormous room, but also from our colleagues around the world.
I'm in the room where they're treating children.
This is a combat zone.
The situation after the typhoon is very complicated.
It was a very tense situation.
OS from the BBC.
The home of the BBC World Service. This is Bobo FM.
BBC News.
BBC News.
World news from the BBC. Violent clashes.
Thick black smoke.
A tremendous legal victory.
Crucial elections.
Destructive winds.
A search and recovery operation.
A race against time.
An imminent threat.
Flying a drone over a rival team's training session.
Whatever is happening, wherever it's happening, catch up with the latest news bulletins from the BBC.
The home of the BBC World Service. This is Bobo FM. Bobo FM. We're making Bobo FM bigger and better. We've got a brand new frequency with even more power. Retune your FM radio to 103.1 now. This is Bobo FM, the home of the BBC World Service, the most trusted news source in the world. Now in our new home of 103.1 FM. This is Bobo 103.1.
For business, they say location, location, location. But really, there's no better location than right here, right now on your mobile phone or laptop. Buy and sell your pre-owned gear where the island is searching online. Buy and sell on ektrade.com. That's ektrade.com.
Across Cayman on 103.1 FM, online, and on your smart speaker. Powered by Health Services Authority, the home of the BBC World Service. This is Bobo 103.1.
BBC News with Sue Montgomery. Large crowds have gathered again in Istanbul to demand the release of the city mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, Turkey's main opposition presidential candidate. He was arrested last week and charged with corruption. The chairman of his CHP party told the crowds the protest was an act of defiance against fascism. But President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said the demonstrations had turned violent. Mark Lewin is in Istanbul.
President Erdogan has got a massive security apparatus under his thumb. He's also got 90% of the Turkish media under his thumb who are not broadcasting live from these protests. But if democracy and rule of law have taken a huge battering under Erdogan, there is one pillar of it that still exists, and that is relatively free and fair elections. And that is what President Erdogan fears, the 2028 presidential election, or an earlier one if he decides to call it, in which polls show Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, would win.
The United Nations says it's reducing its presence in Gaza because of Israel's intensifying bombardment. Stéphane Dujarric is the spokesperson for the UN Secretary-General.
As you know, in the past week, Israel carried out devastating strikes on Gaza, claiming the lives of hundreds of civilians, including United Nations personnel, with no humanitarian aid being allowed to enter the Gaza Strip since early March. As a result, the Secretary General has taken the difficult decision to reduce the United Nations footprint in Gaza, even as humanitarian needs soar and our concern over the protection of civilians intensifies.
Meanwhile, the Israeli military has ordered Palestinians to evacuate the Jabalia area of northern Gaza after rockets were fired at Sderot in Israel. Activists in Israel say one of the Palestinian directors of the Oscar-winning documentary No Other Land has been attacked by Jewish settlers in his village in the occupied West Bank. The Jewish Americans who witnessed the incident say Hamdan Balal was then detained by the Israeli army. The activists say they were also attacked by the masked settlers. The White House has confirmed that a prominent journalist was accidentally texted classified military information about plans for U.S. strikes on Houthi rebels in Yemen. A spokesman said the administration was reviewing how the phone number of Jeffrey Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic magazine, was inadvertently added to a chain. Speaking to journalists, President Trump denied any knowledge of the leak.
I don't know anything about it. I'm not a big fan of The Atlantic. To me, it's a magazine that's going out of business. I think it's not much of a magazine, but I know nothing about it. You're saying that they had what?
They were using Signal to coordinate on sensitive materials and
having to do with what?
With the Houthis.
The Houthis? You mean the attack on the Houthis?
Right.
World News from the BBC. An appeals court judge in Washington has strongly criticised the Trump administration for its summary deportation of alleged Venezuelan gang members to El Salvador 10 days ago. James Boasberg said that Nazis had got better treatment in World War II. His comments came as government lawyers tried to overturn a restraining order that has stopped the deportations. Gary O'Donoghue is in Washington.
For almost 2 hours, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals wrestled with a simple question. Should it overturn a restraining order imposed by a lower court preventing further alleged Trinidad members from being deported under a 1798 law only previously used in wartime? Government lawyers argue the courts in the nation's capital have no jurisdiction over the case, and more broadly, the judiciary's intervention in the case trespasses on the president's national security responsibilities.
Talks between Russian and US representatives on bringing a halt to the war in Ukraine have ended after 12 hours. The Russian news agency TASS said a joint statement would be released on Tuesday. While negotiations were taking place in Saudi Arabia, the northeastern Ukrainian city of Sumy came under a massive Russian missile attack, resulting in 88 injuries. Rights activists in the Sudanese capital Khartoum say at least 5 people were killed when paramilitary forces shelled a mosque. The Emergency Lawyers Network said this happened during evening prayers on Sunday. The Sudanese army has recently been retaking parts of Khartoum from the Rapid Support Forces. Argentina's president has announced he will declassify all intelligence files relating to the period when the country was under military rule. 30,000 people are estimated to have been killed by the military authorities between 1976 and 1983, when democracy was restored. BBC News.
The views and opinions expressed on Straight Talk with Austin and Ellio do not necessarily reflect or represent the views of Stingray Media, its staff, or contributors. Callers to the program accept full responsibility for the views expressed. The show host and affiliates are not liable for any statements made or any harm claimed. All callers to the program indemnify Straight Talk from all claims. Offensive, defamatory, or unlawful content will not be tolerated. Be a part of the conversation by calling 745-2626. Now, here's Straight Talk with Austin and Ellio on Bobo 103.1.
Gentlemen, welcome back to Straight Talk with your host, Austin Harris, and myself, Ellio Solomon. And of course, we have sincere pleasure this evening to be chatting with none other than Mr. Anthony Travers. Again, an individual that we are very proud of. He's always been a great defender of the Cayman Islands, and it has lifted not only our minds in terms of our program here to educate, enlighten, and to elevate, but completely helping to elevate the standard in this particular program as well. We're honored to have had him here today. And of course, the conversation continues. We've got a text that's coming in, but I want to just give you the numbers again if you want to get through the program. 745-2626. That's 745-2626. Or you can WhatsApp or send us messages on 928-2562. That's 928-2562. And I believe you had one, Mr. Harris.
Yes, we do have one question from the listening audience, but just very quickly, coming back from the break, again, You talked about taking care of the golden goose that laid the golden egg, and everyone in the country will certainly appreciate that the golden goose in this country, in terms of earning, has been financial services. But there are some, perhaps even from those financial services, that would otherwise give the impression that that golden goose will keep on laying. So much so that perhaps we can afford to jettison one sector of our cruise sector or tourism sector or the other. But from what I am learning and what we have learned here today, tomorrow is not promised. And whilst Cayman Finance has come out, there was a media article maybe a month ago suggesting that what the country needs is a separate work permit regime so that financial services can hire the right people to fill the right positions so that Cayman can maintain its financial services competitiveness. But from what I'm hearing and from what we've learned through the better part of 2 hours, it's less about personnel and more about the cost of operation, more about protecting an industry, i.e. that golden goose, and that's simply not on anyone's radar. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, in fairness to Cayman Finance, I don't think the two thoughts are mutually exclusive. There's a tendency in these kinds of analyses to oversimplify.
Yes.
Clearly, you have to have high-quality professionals coming to the islands. 35,000 Caymanians can't produce enough high-quality accountants, lawyers. We've done a very, very good job with Caymanian integration. The law school in particular has been a great success. But needless to say, as matters are getting more and more complex, you're going to need more and more professionals. And so, I endorse the Cayman Finance argument that you have to have a continued stream of high-quality personnel for your financial services industry. But if you don't do something about your competitive position vis-a-vis other jurisdictions, you're not going to have a financial services industry to employ anybody or to protect.
Quite right.
Now, I very often, somewhat disparagingly, use the least dirty shirt in the laundry argument. Cayman continues to attract business. It's been very good, actually, at attracting fintech business recently, which is a relatively new line, because of effectively regulatory arbitrage.
Yes.
The SEC in the U.S. were particularly hostile under their previous chairman, Gensler. Trump has come in and changed that. There is a competitive risk. If fintech were domesticated tomorrow to the U.S., going back to the previous caller's question, which looks like it may happen by degree.
Right.
Now, what structures they're going to legitimize in the U.S. and how they operate, we don't know, but it's very possible that's on President Trump's radar.
Yeah. And fintech is things like crypto and
yes,
whatnot.
Exactly. Yes, Web3 generally, token issues, cryptocurrencies, that sort of thing, and we've taken a sort of a leading position there. But the issue when people are looking at jurisdictions is always which is the less troublesome, the less expensive.
Yes.
I was in a Zoom call with a very major U.S. firm last week, talking about fintech jurisdictions, and they were talking about the Seychelles. Now, where did the Seychelles come from in all of this? Who knows? But again, you've got to be the most attractive option.
Right.
And that, goes back to your point, Ellio, which is very good about proportionality. If you keep introducing disproportionate layers of regulation with considerable cost, you're going to end up not being the most attractive jurisdiction.
Indeed.
It's a matter of logic.
Sure.
I can't say when. I can't say even if it will come to pass.
Right.
But it is a concern which I don't think is being adequately addressed when these layers of regulation are being introduced. Because no one is saying, what is the problem we're trying to solve for?
Right.
Where is the money laundering problem?
Right.
Where is the criminal activity? Where is the tax evasion? Where is the tax avoidance?
Indeed.
Because I can say, I frequently say in London, and I'm always met with a response, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? You're a Cayman Islands attorney. But I frequently say, well, I've been here a very long time, and I actually haven't seen any of it.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, just keep getting up every morning and just keep adding another layer of bureaucracy. At some point, the pipe is constricted so much there's no more blood flow there.
Well, that's the concern.
Yeah.
I'm not smart enough to know if it materializes, but that's certainly the concern that ought to be addressed with a much higher degree of forensic analysis than appears to be the case currently.
Well, I think that's good advice, and the country would certainly be well served to maybe have a listen. But to your point, Ellio, we do have at least one voice note on the WhatsApp number, 928-2562. If I can encourage you, Tony, to put on your headset.
Oh, sure.
Otherwise, you won't be able to hear it. Let's go to the callers' viewpoints.
Yeah, good evening, Mr. Austin, Mr. Ellio, and Mr. Anthony Travers. Really enjoying your discussion this evening. Mr. Travers is certainly one of those trailblazers and capitalists and very learned. And so your discussion today about the public registers of beneficial ownership is so crucial. It's crucial to our financial services industry, crucial to the many Caymanians and upcoming Caymanians who are in that industry and those that are preparing to join that industry, and it's part of our lifeline with tremendous contribution to our GDP. So in regard to the public register of the beneficial ownership, I join you in asking why is it being pushed upon us in this fashion? This whole issue of, I think it's called interested parties, which could include, like you mentioned, journalists who could access information of who owns entities, and this could obviously lead to, as you mentioned, kidnapping, blackmail, and whatnot, which is terrible, you know. But the other thing is too that it seems to be a conflict. This whole beneficial ownership thing seems to be a conflict with the provisions of the Data Protection Act. Is also contrary, in my view, to the global data protection regulations of the EU and privacy in general. In our Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, there's a right to privacy. And so I don't know why we haven't been more aggressive, or we have stopped being aggressive and assertive in global public relations, in lobbying, in pushing back, and trying to educate the world on the importance of jurisdictions like the Cayman Islands to the global flow of capital and global trade. Or is that now an exercise in futility? I don't think so. I think we need to continue to push on that and not let up. I was amazed to hear, after years of discussion about getting somewhere with this beneficial ownership register, public registers, that all of a sudden it seems like we kind of capitulated and gave up on it. And that's not a good sign. And I wonder, Mr. Travers, if the new UK Labour government, whether this is a shift in their philosophy. And you mentioned about the US and them going into being a major tax haven and taking a lot of the trust business away from places like Cayman Islands because of them becoming more tax neutral and opening up and not having a public register. Whether all of this could be a play between the new Trump administration and the UK Labour government as part of this these deals that these guys make to unsource a lot of the business and deprive legitimate offshore centers like the Cayman Islands. So it's a very, very interesting topic. I thank you, sir, for taking the time to analyze it. Keep up the good work, and I'm in your corner as well in terms of doing what we can do to educate and to resist unfair tactics. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, caller, for those comments and questions. Mr. Travers.
Well, I much as I love a good conspiracy theory, I don't think there's any correlation between the U.S. position on withdrawing the effect of the Corporate Transparency Act and and the UK position on beneficial ownership registers. The US position that led to the development of South Dakota, Wyoming, has been in process for 7 or 8 years. There was a threat to it in terms of introducing the Corporate Transparency Act, although in the US that did not apply to trusts, let me say, at any point. But now that threat has fallen away. No, I think the British government and the virtue signaling on this this public access point, I think predated the socialist government in England. There's one of the protagonists in England is actually a Conservative MP, a chap called Mitchell, who has a very limited understanding of financial structuring in the Cayman Islands, to put it charitably. And of course, Dame Margaret Hodge was the socialist, and she's now sitting in the House of Lords. I think it's Lady Hodge now. But the virtue signaling on this point, let me go back to that came out of the United Kingdom, I think was born of a guilty conscience, because there are 3 or 4 postcodes in central London which are almost entirely purchased with the proceeds of criminal activity. And no investigation is really done about it whatsoever. It bolsters the UK economy to the tune of hundreds of billions of pounds a year. And as I said earlier to Ellio, saying we're going to straighten this problem out by dealing with the Cayman Islands is simply a massive exercise in blame deflection.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much for that response. And with the time remaining, giving us just about 9 minutes left before we have to wrap this one up, the phone lines remain open at 745-2626. Or, of course, if you would prefer, you can WhatsApp us, 928-2562. From there, you can either send us a WhatsApp audio note or a WhatsApp traditional text message. Ellio, do we have any final questions that are burning? Perhaps we, failed to ask all of them?
Not really in my mind. I mean, I think, as usual, Mr. Travers has done an excellent job. I think we've kind of covered all the bases.
Yes.
And I'm really at the point of just, again, sharing the accolades for my friend. I mean, he jovially stated coming in here about the carbon dating, but he's definitely been around and doing a lot on behalf of the Cayman Islands. So I'm just prepared to give him accolades and thanking him for coming in.
Yes, well, now's a good time.
Now's a good time as ever.
Extend our vote of thanks and again, welcome some closing remarks.
Yeah, so I will say, without quoting names, I did have an opportunity one time to sit in the court and heard a good lawyer say that if the turtle comes from the river bottom and tell you that it's cold, it's cold. And so I'd say that where I don't want to say you look anything like a turtle, Mr. Travers.
I'm nothing like that good looking.
Yes. Let me just say that it has been extremely well to know that you have a learned person like yourself with a tremendous amount of experience on many different fronts when it comes to financial services coming in here to speak with us. And again, bear with me, but it is as a genuine compliment. Knowing that you would take the time out of your business schedule to come and share your knowledge and experience with the public, and again, elevating just a very standard on this program. So I really want to thank you for all the things you're doing for the Cayman Islands, and thank you very much for coming into the studio today and chatting with us.
You're welcome. Anytime.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you, Austin. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is 6:21, and like I said, it's been an awesome discussion chatting with Mr. Travers, and I know my colleague looks like he wants to say something as well.
I'm just wondering whether Mr. Travers had any closing remarks he wanted to share.
He told me early on he didn't, but go ahead.
No, I think I've covered the ground more than adequately. If any questions do arise subsequently, I'm happy to come back and
that is awesome
chat with you guys again.
Yeah,
it's been a real pleasure.
All right, well, there you go. Thank you for that. I thought my colleague had caught me out and therefore didn't give you a chance, but there you go. I thought you said you didn't really want to say much more, but thank you again, Mr. Travers. And the public has heard it. Again, Mr. Tony Travers is willing to come back in here in the studio one day when we reach another point in the road that we need to hear a little bit more of that knowledge and experience. Again, thank you.
Absolutely. Well, certainly to the listening audience, if you missed any part of today's discussion, Well, shame on you. You should have been with us from the beginning. But not to worry. You won't have to pay the price forever. You can go back to our YouTube archives at Straight Talk Radio Show and view the beginning, the middle, the end until your heart is content.
Instagram, and soon Facebook.
And Instagram, and very soon streaming on Facebook as well. But I, too, want to, very briefly thank Mr. Travers for being our guest in studios. We have what we say are our three primary goals on this program, despite what you may have heard. Here they are, and they are to educate, enlighten, and to elevate the members of our listening audience on the issues that prevail, the issues that certainly impact all of our daily lives. And again, on the subject of financial services, we could not have asked for a better guest than you have been. And I want to thank you for that, and Ellio for facilitating that discussion.
That's it.
Very kind words, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Entirely my pleasure.
Well, I was happy to reach out to him. He actually came and did a wonderful interview with me one day on Vision, which one day I'll be sharing with the public. But honestly, you couldn't pay for a guest like this, and here he is willing to give his time for free. Right? Well, we couldn't afford it if we had to pay.
Well, as we develop our digital side, and obviously the streaming video is just one aspect of our digital or electronic presence in this discussion. But as we develop things such as a website, a web page in particular, maybe we can draw from some of those nuggets, those golden nuggets you had from Vision, and add them to our own content.
We will. Well, you helped me on that. Come on. You helped me. Well, you were there, too. We've done a lot together.
We have done a lot of work together, and certainly it's a pleasure to be doing it again. And over the course of, obviously, this growing out our long-term strategy, we hope to share more of that body of work with the listening audience. With 4 minutes, 30 seconds remaining before we have to wrap it up, really just an opportunity to take a quick snapshot, if you will, of what is coming up around our own horizon, starting with tomorrow. Ellio?
Yeah, well, I do want to, well, first of all, there's two things coming up tomorrow. I want you to tune in. You probably saw us getting some free advertisement from all of our, I don't know what to call them, fan base.
Yes, yes.
Our fan base has been promoting us all day, and that's the reason is because tomorrow, let me just state, first of all, many of you would have known that Miss Marla Dukaran, the economist, came to the country and engaged herself in this conversation on cruise piers. And to pretty much paraphrase her words, it was, entering into a very divisive topic here in the country. Again, the caveat is, you enter at your own risk. But either way, she dived in, and I didn't have a chance to refute a lot of the things that she said. Tried calling into CMR. Doors were closed. I don't know if that's guest protection or exactly what that was. But same thing happened on radio. Came on, made a myriad of different calls, couldn't get in. So I think we're left with no other choice other than to take the snippets from what she has said and then respond to those. And so my colleague, with all of his technical wisdom in terms of, audio and video snipping, has went ahead and
just here to help, buddy.
Yeah, the government. We're the government.
We're here to help. We're here to help.
Yeah, slip for better grip. And so he's went ahead and taken all these snippets, and hopefully we get them in the right order tomorrow.
Yes.
And I just simply want to be able to respond to them, because with the greatest of respect, in my humble opinion, there was a lot of misinformation there, and there's a lot of missing data that, quite frankly, I think she could have, or anybody could have had access to, and in my humble opinion, offer a much more balanced report. But I hope to have that discussion tomorrow right here on Straight Talk. In addition to that, I do want to give a little bit of a plug that ACT will be having a meeting at the South Sound Community Center tomorrow, starting around 6 o'clock, 6:30. I want to encourage everyone to come. It should be fun. We're in the thick of the neighborhood of the sort of anti-peer group, so it's going to be fun. Come down there, join us, and show your support for the peers, or just come down there and see if you can get some new information that will allow you to make what I humbly believe is the right decision for the country. We've had the pleasure, not that I want to entwine him into this, but we've had the pleasure to have Mr. Tony Travers. And if I could paraphrase, let's be clear, our financial services industry there's a lot of uncertainties there. And the UK continues to put on top of us legislation after legislation. And really what it's doing, in my humble opinion, is slowly constricting the arteries in this body called financial services. And soon this country financially is going to have a heart attack. And this is not the time to be shutting down industry. This is the time to be looking at new opportunities, ways to diversify, to make sure that there's something else to parallel with, to jump to, whatever. So want to encourage you to come out tomorrow, South Sound Community Center at the around 6:30. And again, of course, listen right here to Straight Talk starting at 4:30 sharp. Sharpo.
Yes.
To make sure you hear exactly what I have to say about The Economist. Ms.
Indeed.
Marta
Well,
Duca.
given all the comments and all the publications by, again, I think that's a very good point you made, a good description. The fan club, the
fan
Straight Club
base, yeah.
fan club. You don't want to miss tomorrow's
The
program.
Watcher is
I
the fan
promise
club.
you, it will be a doozy, to say the least. But just also very quickly, on Wednesday, we will be welcoming in studios at 4:30, very promptly, we will be welcoming the constituent for the independent constituent for the constituency of Red Bay, independent candidate for Red Bay, Mr. Philip Ebanks will be joining us at 4:30. Possibly, maybe we might have another candidate join us at 5 o'clock. But if not, we'll take on other issues in the public domain, such as the ongoing debate on Cayman's point system for PR, which, again, another group of lawyers say is not working. Maybe tomorrow, maybe Wednesday, we'll examine those. But we're your host, Austin Harris.
And I'm Ellio Solomon. See you right here tomorrow on Straight Talk.
The BBC on Bobo. This is the BBC World Service. Across Cayman on Bobo FM. The following commercial messages are brought to you exclusively by Stingray Media.
Join Capella Music Festival for the annual Soundbites Charity Dinner on Thursday, March 27th at Mykonos State Club in benefit of Loud Silent Voices. Hosting special guests, Gramps Morgan and author Dr. Annabelle Manalo Morgan. Tickets are $195 CI for a 3-course dinner, wine, and a welcome cocktail. Enjoy musical entertainment, special guest attendees, and after-dinner dancing. Purchase your Soundbites dinner tickets now at CapellaMusicFestival.com.